She's a student in the Bachelor of Professional Communications program, and she's also the engagement assistant at Royal Roads University and a social media volunteer for the Canadian Public Relations Society of Vancouver Island. I would like to just say thanks to Maliha, Ahmed, and Liana Kiddy-Gan for coming in today, and I'll pass it over to Ali, who will be the host for this session.
Thank you, Chase. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick land acknowledgement. As we're meeting virtually today, we are still going to be grateful and acknowledge the traditional lands of the Swepsum and Lekwungen people. I'm coming to you today from Royal Roads, and you can also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands of the place that you are currently in. So today we're going to be having a session on corporate lip service to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our presenters today are Maliha, Ahmed and Liana Kiddy-Gan. They've been collaborating together since they met in 2013. They focus on the representation of marginalized people and their places in the social body. Maliha comes from a linguistics background and notably collaborated on an op-ed about gendered pronouns for Scientific American. Liana has a background in feminist studies and theater, literature, and public service, with training in science, communication around art, nature, and environmental restoration. I'll be monitoring the chat today for your questions so that we can all enjoy listening to this presentation. And with that, I will hand it off to our presenters.
All right, we do have a slideshow. I have a question about that.
Okay, so I'm
You
gonna
should
be
share screen on the bottom. That should allow you to share your slides.
okay. Let me go ahead and get that started.
Great.
And I'm so sorry. Let's see.
On the West Coast Island, so we're chill. Don't worry.
Okay,
Yes,
cool, cool.
exactly.
We're also
Yeah.
West Coast, but they're so much less chill here. Oh, that wasn't right.
I can share your screen too if you'd like. You sent me your slides. So if you have any problems, I can happily put those up for you.
I think that would be good because I am not seeing the share screen on this. So,
Okay.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Hang on one.
It's Timothy's fault.
I'm sorry, I see it now. Okay.
Okay.
And then is it just start broadcast?
Yeah, then
Okay, cool. And then everybody sees their own face. Wait, sorry, where did I put my? It's in the. I opened it on. Here it is. All right, cool. We're good. We're good.
Okay, good.
Thank you for your patience, everyone. So grateful. And also very glad to be here. Okay, so Liana, you want to get started?
Yeah. So, yep, our presentation is on corporate lip service. We also have our other title is Lies My Corporation Told Me DEI Initiative Edition. Thank you, Ali, so much for the introduction. And my name's Liana.
My name's Maliha. Okay, and then next slide. Oh, I don't know how to change slides on this. Okay. All right, cool. It made it. It made it. All right. So some background information on us. Liana.
Yeah, so I do have a BA in feminist studies. I focused mainly on power and representation. Currently work at a library and am interested in public service and also do restoration work here I live in Denver right now. So in the mountains.
Yes. So I'm a linguist, as Ali mentioned, and my primary interest is in sociophonetics. As you can imagine, I'm very interested in racism. and working on racism, I mean, but, and I'm also a book editor. So far I've helped edit 2 books. One of them is Heal Your Love by Luna Marbruja, and then Queer and Trans Artists of Color by Nia King. And one thing that's really shaped my work is that I've contracted at various tech companies. So that's led me to independent research on content moderation. So to give you background, we wanted to be clear that we're speaking as people who were raised in Silicon Valley, California. So a lot of the things we're going to say are going to be pretty like America-centric. We are going to try to universalize a little bit as well. Okay, next slide.
So what we're going to talk about is how these different departments in corporations, of course, they have been instituted to help people's lives be better, help people deal with racism in the workplace, for example. But often these initiatives and departments fall short of what they can truly accomplish. We're looking for a true supportive environment for everyone that's inclusive. And throughout this talk, we hope that we show that we can't rely on profit-driven corporations alone to provide these important services to people. So we're going to talk about how corporations use communications in order to increase their perception of equity and other sorts of like obfuscations in order to get away with, yeah. So we're going to talk about how DEI goals don't get met. We're going to talk about how HR can say they resolved complaints but don't. We're going to talk about how wellness teams don't lead to wellness. And we're going to bring that back to the profit motive, legal liability on the part of corporations, and also promoting branding. That's what it's about. And we think that this is a highly unethical way to communicate and to can be remedied by altering power dynamics, such as forming committees with real decision-making power, having regulations, and having unions.
Yeah, so we're talking about how policies and speech are created and said within a field of possibilities, but then they live and breathe within the context of a real life environment. And this has real consequences on people's quality of life and what kind of choices they even have to make. We're also talking about what companies say versus what they do. So the choices that companies, that employees actually are able to make is not necessarily so relevant here as what choices they even have. So one example that we are really struck by is last summer during the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd was killed. It was really hot for every company to express a message of support. Every company put out a message saying something along the lines of like, we rebuke racism. But then when it came to like actionable things like hiring Black people, making it, or, you know, like working against law enforcement and violence, you know, these things they did not actually pull through on. An example that I read about kind of recently was about how Black journalists were being hit up and inundated with requests to write during the protest, after the protest, but then like here we are months later and they're ghosted. There's nothing, like people aren't like, it's like it's hard to hire them for specific times, as opposed to recognizing that Black journalists are also at heart journalists. They're able to write at all times of year, not just Black History Month and Black Lives Matter protests. Yeah. So because of where we are and what kind of research has been done, we do talk primarily about like Google employees, Google missteps and culture. But there is other research about other companies, and a lot of the stuff we say can be extrapolated to other tech companies.
And what we found too was that like, so we grew up in Silicon Valley, we've seen a lot of that culture develop, but what we're seeing is these different hubs developing in different cities, and including in Canada. So we're definitely talking about something that is either happening in a lot of other places or is going to happen and should be looked out for.
Yeah, I mean, these companies, most of them have international presences. Yeah, right. So the last thing we're going to talk about after DEI, HR, and wellness team, all this for what? So to what end these departments are working towards, and then why and how we can kind of change course. And this includes both like individual and collective actions. All right, next slide. So we're starting with certain assumptions and definitions. So our assumptions that we're starting with is everyone works hard, everyone wants to thrive. Systemic inequities such as racism, colonialism, and sexism exist. So with this, what we mean is that we're not gonna be assuming that the reason that there aren't more marginalized people in like higher up positions, like CEOs or even executives, like the reasons that people aren't in those positions is not because they don't want it. It's not because they don't want to work hard for it. Like there aren't more women in tech, and it's not because women are bad at math or don't like math. These things are fallacies. We're not gonna entertain them. Yeah, so we're not here to blame people for their consequences.
Right.
And Liana?
Just to talk a little bit about what these departments even are. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's usually initiatives, committees. You can see them in governments, corporations, universities, any kind of organized space might try to do something in this vein. And it's supposed to be more inclusive and for marginalized people, such as people of color, women, disabled people. Yeah, HR, human resources is a vital part of any corporation, definitely, that hires and fires people, manages staff training, vacation time, wellness, enforcement of their policy, and we're going to talk a lot about how they mediate workplace conflicts. Corporate wellness is can be programs or efforts geared towards increasing the physical or mental health of employees. There's direct benefits to corporations to have these, although it's not always something that they offer. It lowers how much they pay for employee health care, and it increases productivity, and hopefully people are happier, but we're gonna see that that's not really the main point of them, we think. Yeah.
Yeah, so these efforts are all great in theory for the purpose of fixing these systemic inequalities against marginalized groups. But in practice, if these things aren't made into law, aren't made into regulation, much of the responsibility is pushed onto individuals rather than onto decision makers, because there's rarely any incentives or repercussions related to DEI. Like, to name a few benefits of DEI, like diverse workforces can lead to like higher creativity, problem solving, decision making skills, and yet other things are prioritized, and that would be like the things we get into later, like professionalism, and yeah. But these things are very cultural. All right, cool. Next slide.
So we're really wanting to know what you guys think about all these. So we here we're asking you a question. Feel free to tell us what you think in the chat, and we can talk about it for a minute.
Yeah.
So when a company says they're committed to DEI, what have you seen them do or say, or not say or not do?
Okay, so we'll give it a minute, and while we are doing that, I will figure out how to look at everybody's faces while also being in screen share mode.
Let's see. All right.
Oh, I was doing it on here. Yeah, that's why. Thank you. So nice having tech support.
Let's see. So I do see a question on probably we had a little comic about inequity versus equity versus equality and justice. Definitely, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about how it's affecting what it is and how it's affecting people. Let's see. So a big difference between equity and equality, the way we're using it and the way that the distinction that makes it important is that like equality means everyone having the same thing, and equity means everyone having enough for a certain standard of like living, for example. The example I really like is equality would look like giving everyone pregnancy leave or certain services for helping you with pregnancy, but obviously half the population doesn't need to use those services, so that's not what equity would really be talking about.
Yeah.
And then justice is also referring in this comic is referring to the structure, the surrounding context that is leading to why we're needing to talk about equity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then to answer Kelly, what are your thoughts on employee-led working groups within organizations to work on these topics? We're a big fan. We love employees getting together to improve their workplaces. We think that collectively you do have more power, and then we do have, we talk a lot about it. Yeah, okay, so you guys have a pretty good idea of what DEI is supposed to look like. But as you already know, in practice, there's usually factors at play that change what it can actually accomplish, right? All right, so let's briefly go over what communication is. Okay, next slide. So we've got, this is like an older, kind of more simplistic model of communication. It was made a while ago, and it's primarily about radio, but we think it's pretty effective to illustrate the point we're about to make about communication breakdown. So a linear mode of communication is there's a sender, there's a channel or a message. So the channel would be like either the mode of communication. So like, do you hear it from a press conference? Do you hear it on a phone? As well as what the message is that you're actually being told. And then the final step is the receiver. And a better mode is an interactive mode of communication where there's an extra step added where the receiver is able to offer feedback to the sender. So then that creates a kind of more fully functioning form of communication. Oh, yes, sorry, you go ahead, Liana.
No worries. So what we're mainly bringing this up for is because when we're thinking about ethics in this structure, we're looking at sender intention and their choice in channel. That's mainly what we're looking for, hence why we're talking about Google's communications, for example. Let's see. And we're also, in terms of this chart, we are looking at both the internal channels that these corporations have to communicate within them, and also how there needs to be more external accountability on the way that these messages are presented and said. We're also thinking about how, a lot of these corporations, if they had ethical intentions, they would find a way to do it. That's kind of like
no point making excuses for them. They're like, these companies are huge. Why are we going to make excuses for like, oh well, I mean, it's really hard to always be ethical, right? Like, no, we're not here for this.
So we're gonna look into ways that these channels break down, and also often the feedback channel is the part that breaks down the most. This includes intentionally vague or business speaky language, as well as working conditions that break down trust, such as like different ways that people feel devalued and silenced, and also microaggressions, like those kinds of things lead to a rotting from the inside of these structure of these channels in this structure. Next slide.
Yes. So we are, let's see. One example of that kind of communication breakdown due to unethical messaging is the case of Dr. Tamit Gabru. She's a world-renowned computer scientist and AI ethicist, and her, like, to give an example of like how powerful her research has been, it led directly to several cities over here in NorCal, or Northern California, directly disallowing facial recognition tech to be used by law enforcement because she provided evidence that these models are frequently inaccurate and perpetuate racism. Yeah, if the models are inaccurate, we shouldn't be using them to put people in jail. But yeah, so she was recently fired from her position as a lead for Google's AI ethics team for writing a paper that was criticizing large language learning models. So this would be kind of like, not like Google Translate, but more like a text generator. So she was criticizing these large language learning models for both duplicating and amplifying racism and sexism, as well as like ecological downsides and stuff. So some of these large models were created by Google. Google was unwilling to deal with this kind of criticism, and so they wanted her to retract the paper after it had already passed internal publication review and had been accepted at another journal. So when Dr. Gabru naturally asked why they had hidden the normally open peer review process, and she asked for the rationale for why they should retract the paper, they fired her and they claimed that she had resigned. So Dr. Gabru said that this was the last in a long pattern of disrespect and racism, both professionally and personally, from Google. It's also really hard to ignore that this kind of blatant disrespect and retaliation happened to a Black woman who is famous in her field. How many people with less power do not get international attention when they try to affect the same kind of change that she has? So if we draw this back to the linear mode of communication that we had on the last slide, here Google is the channel, Google is the sender, and the message that they sent was retract your paper. And Tamit tried to offer the feedback of like, can we have a conversation about this? And then Google like retaliated for her offering that feedback, as well as changed the mode of communication. She didn't, they changed the channel. Like, she didn't find out that she was fired directly. She found out because her direct reports were sent an email saying like, we've accepted your boss's resignation. So neither her manager knew, or yeah, her manager wasn't involved. Her direct reports were the ones who told her. Yeah, so Dr. Gabru getting fired in retaliation for feedback here became symbolic. When we look at the intention of the sender here, we ask, why does Google have an ethics team when they plan to reject ethics papers that will criticize them? Her firing became the message passed from Google to the receiver, and then the receiver becomes other employees interested in reforming AI ethics issues at Google. This became a warning, basically. You can't criticize us. All right, next slide.
DEI and HR departments are supposed to prevent such obvious retaliation, as well as like government or things like that are supposed to be able to address that. But in practice, we're arguing that this is exactly how these departments function. I love this quote. It's Karen Barad, a great feminist writer. Discourse is not what is said, it is that which constrains and enables what can be said. We see that these departments are constraining and enabling what can be said about and within these companies around fairness and equity. The fact is that DEI type policies have been around for decades, but companies have found ways to sound equitable with acting with bias. Some examples that we have, so you can institute salary bands. So you have salary ranges for certain positions. It's supposed to mean that everyone gets paid around the same amount, but companies can still get away with biased compensation practices through having different pay in terms of sign-on bonuses, annual bonuses, and stock-based compensation, which actually ends up being a very large difference for some people. Another example is in 2018, California passed a law requiring corporations that were primarily based in California to have at least one woman on their board of directors. And most companies do have at least one woman, but it didn't, only 33 corporations out of 500 actually have gender balanced boards. So we see that even things that are supposed to lead towards better decisions don't actually end up creating widespread gender equality. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, and sorry, my other screen went backwards. Okay, so in these ways, DEI initiatives sometimes prevent real conversation about company bias and discrimination because their existence occasionally is used to provide plausible deniability, while HR in the background shuts down complaints. So we can see DEI as a field of possibility that has led to very real changes towards equity. But then, as Liana mentioned earlier, DEI efforts on a non-governmental level, sometimes they tend to say more and do less, because statements are given, minimal measures are put in place, and this creates a narrative of change with minimal real change. So Dr. Gabru wrote a letter to her coworkers at Google shortly before getting fired in December of 2020, and she told people, stop writing your documents because it doesn't make a difference. She said that because with zero accountability, DEI initiatives will never fulfill their lofty goals because there won't be an incentive to meet them and there won't be repercussions if they fail. Okay, next slide. So
another question that we'd love for you to answer. This is. Sorry, Maliha.
It's okay. So this is about professionalism. So have you ever noticed any professional behavior that felt unjust? So either to you or that you witnessed. So this would be including like somebody accused of being unprofessional.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a really good point, Kelly. Oh, sorry, I should say for the, yes, it is considered more professional to not speak up than to speak up. In different cultural ways of communicating in the workplace, diversity being accepted on a surface level only. I was given more work simply because I could handle it and never complained. Ugh.
Yeah, what we're arguing is that they're definitely what we think is professional and supposed to be devoid of that cultural context. We're arguing that it is totally culturally taught and coded with all the things that come with culture, any kind of bias. Yeah. And in this context, we're talking specifically about HR. So HR is vital. It's important to be able to have a channels to go to help employees resolve issues or figure out how they're relating to the company. But HR can also be used to uphold this very specific culturally based standard of professionalism. And professionalism is, well, going back to what we were talking about, discourse, it is something that also mediates what kind of communication is allowed. Yeah, just like thinking that you have to be quiet all the time. While some people prefer to be quiet more often, there's nothing that says that's going to make work better.
Oh man, I see that one of you mentioned the COVID thing. Yeah, the person this iPad belongs to was actually told that he asked if he was an essential worker, and his boss told him, well, I mean, this thing that you have to do to come into the office is essential to your job, which is like, that's not the point. Yeah, so that's another form of like professionalism that is unjust, but like we're mostly talking about bias and discrimination here. Okay, so next slide. Yeah, so a lot of these things that like relate to professionalism, this happens at, you know, every country or every company, but it also happens at Google. because so many of those things that are considered being professional, they are culturally understood and not spoken, which is why they tend to end up favoring one specific class of people because that's who made it up. Google makes some of this implicit thing very explicit by referring to metrics that their employees should have. So some of the things that they tell you are very clear, such as like, you should be knowledgeable about any role that you're applying for. But then on the other hand, there are unclear things such as googliness. This is akin to kind of like a social credit score in China, or like just like je ne sais quoi that they feel about you. And because googliness is such a vague metric, it becomes one in a line of phrases that can be used to occasionally discuss race without talking about race, or gender without talking about gender, and so on. Or discuss like the ways that like somebody in the chat said that you're expected to not speak up. If you do speak up, you're seen as like being, you know, a certain way, and therefore like you're not googly anymore. And we live in an at-will state. What that means is that they can fire you for any reason. And people have literally been fired for not being googly enough. Go ahead, Liana.
And so I love this picture. It's like the picture they have on Wikipedia, and I think it really captures kind of the vibe they're going for. Like, I don't know, something about the grasses and the trees make it seem so idyllic, and yet somehow like kind of scary. Like, to me, it's scary to see this big window pane. But so here's the Googleplex complex in Mountain View, and this for sure is not just a Mountain View problem, although it has been not, well, Google being a Mountain View problem, right? The biases in googliness have lived and resided in Mountain View, but it definitely is not just a Mountain View problem. We think that this is, we know that Google has opened up complexes all over the place, and we hope that you guys relate to this, these standards. Yeah.
Okay, so when Dr. Gabru was fired, the person who fired her claimed that her paper was not academically rigorous enough. And then he indirectly accused her of aggression and hostility by saying that she demanded the names of the people who reviewed the paper. So to focus on the first part for a second, her paper had 158 sources. This would normally be considered way over the top in academic in academic rigor. And to focus on the second part, where he accused her of aggression by saying, to me, demanded all the names of everybody who was involved in the review. Google has a culture of open review, so not providing those names is the abnormal thing. This was a deceptive sort of communication. This was a way to call her like unprofessional without like saying it, a way to call her aggressive without saying it. These are like coded terms. So yeah, this can be explained when you're looking for other bias in Google's company culture as well. Because HR, for instance, generally speaking, is a tool to try to solve conflicts in a company with the least amount of damage done to the company. This means that they try to create opportunities for mediation and arbitration in an attempt to keep conflicts from escalating into like PR scandals or lawsuits. So other examples of bias in human relations would be, so one thing that is, I think, well known is hiring metrics. So if you have a white name, you're more likely to get hired than, or like hired or an interview or even a callback than if you have a non-white name, which is, you know, very exciting for Maliha Ahmed. There is also a bias against feminine descriptors. So, and this holds true across a variety. So I'm still like, for instance, fairly early in my career, but Margaret Mitchell, who is Tamika Gabru's co-lead before they were both fired recently, Margaret started going by M. Mitchell, just her initial, to kind of avoid the sexism that she was dealing with before. And it's like, it can't escape you even when you get later in your career. Another example of a bias in HR is linguistic bias. So a lot of these companies, these tech companies, they have these cultures of like, we're going to be disruptive And they say they want efficient communication, but then they create new language that is unnecessary, but you have to learn it to be able to fit in. And this is obviously not going to be as easy for everyone. Yeah, an example of like a word that we really didn't need, but now we have is learnings. Yeah, like here's all the learnings we have planned for this presentation. There was also a recent, a person who spoke out recently. Her name is April, and she was talking about how she was discriminated against. She was a talent acquisition person at Google, and she was discriminated against, and she was told that she should disclose her accent because it's a disability. April is from Baltimore. Baltimore is in America. This is devaluing otherness and devaluing differences instead of finding ways to appreciate them. It's finding ways to exclude them. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
So here is a non-exhaustive list of characteristics that we know have very strong power dynamics attached to them towards bias in race and class distinctions and stuff like that. So feel free in the comments to ask about a few in particular, but we are only going to talk about a few. But so the idea here is all of these things are used in ways to devalue people who are different or get away with a behavior that might be racially motivated and happens more to people of color, but they're saying, oh, I'm not racist, I'm just I just value the written word, for example. So paternalism, I think, is really interesting. It's what happens when those without power decision making don't really know how decisions get made or who makes them even, and yet they're completely familiar with the impact of those decisions, right? The idea is that they're like a child, like they couldn't possibly understand, or why tell them, like that kind of idea. That's paternalism. Power hoarding is also a really interesting one. It's just the idea that if there's anything challenging to say about something, it means that it's like a direct threat on that. People will often feel threatened if you want to improve the way that something is happening and they feel that it's tied to themselves for some reason. For example, all these things we're saying about DEI, I love DEI, I love DEI people. That doesn't mean I shouldn't also, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be space to talk about how things can be done better, definitely.
Yeah, so please don't take it personally if you're here from HR or from DEI.
You're here
Please
from
keep
HR.
working hard. We want to improve things. All right, so another standard that we want to talk about is objectivity. So this standard of professionalism invalidates people who show emotion, and it creates a false dichotomy where emotion is considered illogical. So the people that you'll tend to see this weaponized against will be women and Black people, because these people are not given the space to be angry without being dismissed as being illogical and unprofessional. I think a lot of women have had that experience of like trying to speak up about something, but if your tone is even the like Hillary Clinton, we have a lot of complicated feelings about her, but I think the main reason that she can frequently come off sounding very robotic is because she doesn't want to come off as angry, and that's been trained into her over 50 years or whatever. Yeah, so another example is we've got a 2-for-1 here where we have a story about so fear of open conflict. So this is related to the power hoarding because you take things very personally and you scapegoat those who cause discomfort instead of seeing it as like a way to improve yourself or improve your company or your team. So we've casually referred to this as real talk theory, where the workplace generally has no system in place to handle real talk. Our story is about our friend who we will call Jim. He was directly asked for suggestions for improvement by his boss for the team. And the answers that he gave tended to be labor-centric. So he was giving answers like, oh, people should be hired on directly instead of through contractors. Oh, the team should be given more time for projects rather than having such tight deadlines. because you know, as contractors, they feel obligated to, you know, do whatever it takes, even if that means work overtime, work whatever. Yeah, he was brought in for a meeting and they told him that his answers were wrong. And they didn't say it like this, I think, but they basically said that it was a problem. They showed him all the other people's answers, and it turns out that the kinds of answers they wanted were more along the lines of, I want a pizza party, that'll be good for employee morale. So another aspect that this shows is like another aspect of unspoken professionalism is either or thinking. So in this case, because he criticized them, he wasn't with them, therefore he was against them. Okay, go ahead, Liana.
All right. Let's see. So yeah, these are all ways that you can dismiss people of color or inclusivity issues. And the truth is, you can jump through logic loops to get to where you want to be to justify anything. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about sentencing disparities in criminal cases leading to Black men being in prison more than other demographics. This is obviously where logic meets unspoken biases or unrecognized biases.
All right, next slide. Yeah, and also feel free to, like, I think we have a resource in our appendix that is where this is from. So if you go through that, that would also be like kind of defining anything that you're not sure about, like how can perfectionism be professionalism or unprofessional? Okay, next slide. So what can you do to be healthy in a difficult or situation or toxic environment? So this is a question for you guys personally. What do you do when you're in a tough like place? How do you make yourself be well? How do you make yourself be healthier? I love a lot of these answers people are giving. I mean, like on previous questions as well. Avoid being friends with coworkers.
Friends is a hard transition to piece through. Exercise, definitely.
Yeah, that's awesome. Roller skating, nice.
Warm drinks and caffeine for sure.
Yeah, I've got my boba literally right here.
Awesome. Wonderful responses. Thank you. So we're going to talk about wellness teams. We're obviously very invested in real wellness. The problem is we don't think corporations are. We see them as tools to release them from legal liability rather than support real health. So while some jobs do let you go on a walk or exercise in some sort of way, it's often not enough, especially when these jobs, some of these tech jobs even, are very like traumatizing or just hard on your body and hard on your mental state.
Yeah, and I mean, you guys are also talking about how like you have to reach out to other people about you know, double checking your what's the word, your gut reaction to things to make sure of how you respond. That's something that yeah, socializing helps, but it's like it really takes a community to be well, and work environments generally don't necessarily what's the word, like encourage that. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
So yeah, there is a book called McMindfulness. I recommend it. It is the product that has zero overhead to ease work stress. And I don't think some of these look like, if you're not getting paid enough, if you're stressed out about being able to pay for rent or feeding yourself or your kids or whoever, it's not enough to have meditation. Meditation can help, but it's not enough. And when we're talking about the ethics of corporations and what they should be doing, it should be more, we think. We can see how this is trying to increase productivity, not really a holistic approach at all, increasing profit over people. And you would think that, like, how could wellness not mean helping people? And because it's not exactly the same, that's our point. So we've talked to wellness coaches, and we found out too that these wellness teams are part of risk and compliance. They're part of the legal team. This directly relates to their role in limiting the company's exposure to lawsuits and limiting their liability in the traumatizing or stressful aspects that they're doing. True health costs money. Living wages, having vacation time, having health insurance. I know in Canada it's a little different, but we only get health insurance for work, and we don't often get it through work here. Having more than 6 weeks of parental leave, for example, it costs real money to provide this real wellness. And it's a widespread practice in Silicon Valley to hire employees through contracting agencies and hire overseas as well. And a lot of countries overseas have weaker labor laws, meaning that they don't have to pay as much, as well as offer minimal benefits. This is why they're doing that, because they're trying not to pay.
Yeah, and part of that is also plausible deniability, because they can say like, oh, well, we didn't know that the Facebook employees in the Philippines were treated so badly because we're in America. Yeah, it just creates layers of organizational distance. But yeah, so as Liana said, we did speak to wellness coaches who provided us with the information that kind of like shaped our view of this. And one of the wellness coaches we spoke to was, he worked with content moderators, and content moderation work, as you've probably heard, is traumatizing and it's difficult. And the people, they generally do not get paid a lot, and productivity is really highly pushed above kind of wellness, above, above being able to do the job well even. And then what kind of wellness was provided by him? The work is traumatizing. The wellness coaches tend to not be trained in trauma counseling. And then the moderators that we spoke to as well, for my personal research, they did not trust wellness coaches to keep counseling sessions private, which means you can't go to this person. They might tell your bosses that you feel this or that about like the way a boss treated you about your work. Like that stuff is like, a lot of you said that it's really important to talk to someone for certain instances when you're trying to be well, when you're trying to deal with a toxic situation. The wellness coach is not the person that you can trust with this. And the coaches offered stuff like exercise, like jumping jacks, going on walks around the building. They didn't, but this is not really enough for such a heavy kind of work, heavy kind of emotional load. Wellness teams in this way are used to create plausible deniability about this reality, and they pawn off moral obligations onto contractors. Yeah, so one of the things that we were thinking about, like for how this could be solved, we looked to the healthcare industry. Health clinics have standard of care regulations. For example, if you're offered a misdiagnosis or a delayed diagnosis, patients can sue for malpractice. Similarly, a major way that Facebook content moderators spoke about being unwell due to the job is that the job would tend to give people post-traumatic stress disorder. Wellness teams should have standards of care that are clearly laid out to employees, and they should face repercussions if employees are burdened with, like, let's say, PTSD, with major trauma that they're then left to deal with on their own. Because the way it is right now, they're not getting paid well. They have to, work themselves to the bone. Well, figuratively to the bone. It's still a computer job, but they work so hard. They have these traumas, and then they're left alone. They don't have good health insurance. They just have to deal with their PTSD while trying to feed often families and stuff. But obviously the jobs differ. There's not only content moderation jobs that fall under this umbrella of who gets to have a wellness team. Not everybody gets PTSD, but these jobs are like sedentary, or a lot of these jobs are sedentary. They're in like one position for 40 hours a week. everybody over 25 knows that this will hurt your back. But yeah, so this is another department. Wellness is another department that is trying to constrain the conversation to say that we're not interested in talking about adding anything to our wellness programs. We've already done enough. The reality is that employees know that they're not going to get any more, even though everyone knows that it isn't enough. So the results that we get are lost trust, employees continue to be unwell and sometimes harbor trauma. There is high turnover and lower productivity. Another thing we want to point out is that some of these jobs are, like some of these contracting jobs are blue collar rather than white collar and, you know, sitting at computers and working. And those jobs a lot of times aren't able to access the same wellness services that are offered to the white collar jobs. Okay, next slide.
Another question for you guys. Why do corporations devote so many resources to this kind of work? What do you guys think? By the way, I love this comment about wellness shifting blame. It becomes a conversation about why are you working here rather than solving the problem. And the problem with having to leave is that no one can build any meaningful relationships together for their work. Everyone has to be retrained all the time. It's not good for the company and it's not good for the culture that you're trying to create. When people think that they just have to leave.
Yeah, like if that's the only way to, you know, you end up losing a lot of the solidarity that you build up as well. Ease the pain without fixing the cause. Check a box for reputation benchmarking, recruitment tactics. Oh, wow. They hold, so one person said that her workplace holds talk about wellness that she can't attend due to work and meetings. It's just there to look good. Great.
I do think that some people are trying to do the right thing, and the whole reason for this presentation too is to try to show that we need to institute the rules and the power structure in a way where these people who want to do good actually have real decision-making power and influence. If they exist, that's great. I like that they exist, but I rather they be able to make decisions. And what we're seeing is they often don't. In Dr. Timnit-Gebru, her whole team was about ethics, and they hired her but didn't want her to write about ethics, you know.
And then and then they face that pushback after she gets fired. Her teammate, her like co-lead Margaret Mitchell, tries to stand up for her, and then she gets fired too. It's like, what kind of communication ethics is that? Okay, this person said
we should probably move on, right, Maliha?
Yeah, we do, but people's comments are so interesting.
They're really good, yeah.
All right, okay, we'll try to move on as well. Okay.
Yeah, so definitely there is a lot of good that can be gotten out of these programs. I'm really glad they exist. They're necessary, but we are looking at some of the ways they can be better. And what it comes down to is we have to address the profit motivation. We have to address the fact that corporations are willing to work towards protecting their legal liability, protecting their branding, instead of protecting their workers, instead of being truthful, being honest about the way that they're conducting business. They rather obfuscate, lie, hide in order to get that branding, basically.
Yeah, to have that solid kind of reputation. Okay, next slide.
Next slide. So there's this great book, Voices from the Valley, Ben Tarnoff and Moira Weigel. I definitely recommend reading it if you want to hear more about Silicon Valley culture and workers. So it's about the hidden workers of Silicon Valley a lot. So cooks, cleaners, people who don't, the reason that they're hidden mainly is because this culture is, everyone has NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. And it turns into a way to completely silence workers from telling other people how they're living how they're having to work. And they're that way we can only hear, the only communication anyone else is getting outside of the company is the PR or marketing. So this book is really great. And this engineer who's talking about Google, again, for some reason, talks about how there was a CEO change who changed the corporate structure to be more hierarchical, made everything very rigid departments and like discourage people from talking to each other. They also lost feedback mechanisms to, like, they weren't getting any responses from higher up managers anymore because they weren't in their department or whatever. And this engineer was saying he thinks that's the reason why Google picked up more unethical projects, because they weren't wanting or getting any feedback from their employees about how they felt about it. Our example is the Google for China that they did for about 10 years. He was saying that, or a censored Google, right? He was saying that all the workers didn't know what was happening or didn't feel empowered to say anything. Oh, I'll just let that happen, I guess, right? Like, if I want to stay here, right? So I think this is a great example of kind of the ways that communication breaks down purposefully or not, and completely get like there is no trust anymore, which is vital.
Yeah, and Google's not exactly wrong that like it keeps people in the company longer than they intend to, maybe, or longer than they would have otherwise if they hide why a decision has been made or what kind of decisions have been made. An example of this is a couple of years ago, Google signed a huge contract with the Department of Defense, and obviously, like, a lot of us in the Bay Area are like anti-militaristic or we just think that it's overfunded, and multiple engineers ended up quitting their jobs. This is like a really principled stance, as well as a really what's the word, like, it's very expensive for Google to have to find good engineers and hire them and train them and everything. So this was like, wow, I hope we can all get to the point in our careers where we could just take these ethical stances and walk out on jobs that are doing horrible things. Okay, next slide.
So I have a quote for you. It's R.M. Hare. It was an ethics book. He says, a community is a group of people who can communicate with each other. If this communication is cut off, then nobody should be surprised if, in order to reestablish it, to make themselves heard, the governed resort to violence. That at least gets them into the newspapers, which their leaders read, so communication is to that extent established. So we're coming at it from the point of view that people will go to any lengths to be heard. It's essential. We're social creatures. We need communication to happen. And the fact that these, as we've shown, these communication channels are cut off, both laterally and horizontally, this leads to lack of trust, obfuscation, confusion on everyone's part, hiding things that we would want to address otherwise, assuming best intentions, right? This leads to conditions that are simply unacceptable to most people in these work environments. Yeah, when we're resorting to having to create scandals to get things heard, and then it's just covered up, nothing's addressed, it still leaves, that's not effective communication, it's not ethical communication. Yeah. Yeah, and also this slide is also about how corporations who know what people want and what would make them happy, which would be getting paid more, having more benefits, leading to better quality life, if they don't want to provide that, their answer is to communicate with violence because they know that will work, because they don't actually have the trust necessary to use words effectively.
And obviously we're not just talking about like literal violence, like riots and stuff, or like Liana mentioned, like scandals or creating other ways to, be like major inconveniences. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So are you comfortable in a world where violence is the common language? So you don't have to answer this question in the chat. It's mostly for you to answer for yourself. But if these modes of communication keep breaking down, we shouldn't be surprised when the only modes of communications that we can establish are kind of more violent. And are we comfortable in a world where people don't have those other modes of communication, where things can be talked out? Okay, so I'll go to the next slide. So the quote by R.M. Hare that Liana mentioned earlier about violence and communication, this was more controversially stated by Malcolm X, who said that you could only speak to someone in a language that they understand. You can't speak Chinese to someone who only understands Swahili, you know? So violence is the language of the oppressor. So Malcolm X explained that those people will not understand the different language of peaceful protest. So the example here that we're giving is of UC Davis in 2011. So we can see the disparate kind of communication because the students, they're sitting down, they're covering their faces, and the cops are pepper spraying them. The students never physically attacked cops. They did not deserve to be pepper sprayed. The cops are speaking that language of violence while the students are speaking the language of nonviolence. The school system was not interested in real dialogue. They understood that the protest was in order to undermine their authority, and they were interested in suppression, not in open communication.
An example that hits more on us is our alma mater, which is University of California, Santa Cruz, has had a long, the graduate students protesting for many years for better living wages and working conditions. And this last year, there was police brutality at these protests. And it's so ironic because the slogan, one of the slogans for our school is the original authority on questioning authority. And we just think that's a very, very stark situation happening. Another example from the Voices from the Valley book is how, so everyone's anonymous. So all I know is that they're a cook in this area. How a normal day would be waking up at 5 a.m., getting to work at 6, being done at 3, going to another job, getting home at around midnight. And that's like Monday through Friday, or, that's a full-time work schedule, and how a lot of the cooks had to work that job. And I just think there's a brutality in having their only option be to work those hours in that way. I think brutality and violence can look like pepper spray. It can look like having to work two full-time jobs to feed your kids and like not having any savings out of it or anything. It looks like having no rent forgiveness during a global pandemic, which is what's been happening here. The great thing about that example, though, is that the cook did union work for those contractors, and they did get more benefits and more respect out of their jobs. Next slide.
Yes. So going back to Dr. Tanika Baru, so another example of like finding, solutions other than just unionizing, Dr. Kabru wrote an email to a group of women and allies that work at Google. So it's an email list, and she wrote this email shortly before she was fired. I believe we linked to it in the appendix. She spoke about how Google asked their marginalized employees to work on diversity initiatives that generally don't amount to anything. To quote her, "Writing more documents and saying more things over and over again, it will tire you out, but no one will listen." She says that this kind of internal approach to creating change will not work efficiently, and that employees should rather focus on leadership accountability and applying external pressure. For example, the Congressional Black Caucus, this is a group of elected politicians who are all Black. They are lawmakers, and they'd be able to force issues a lot more powerfully than the average employee. And another example is Facebook. Facebook wouldn't have reformed the working conditions of their content moderators as much as they did without the without the reputational risk that was created by content moderators speaking to the media. So we can see that the ethics team that she was on, they weren't empowered to enact real ethical recommendations nor actions. And this is shown by the fact that they fired her co-lead Margaret Mitchell, and then they were replaced by a manager who was a little bit more obedient to the company's bottom line and priorities. She is not alone in thinking that corporations will not hold themselves to account to improve the lives of their employees. The CEO, Dan Price, a reformed CEO, he became known 6 years ago for slashing his own pay to $70,000. He, I think before that, he earned like over $1 million every year. He slashed his pay all the way down in order to be able to pay all of his employees a minimum wage of at least $70,000 as well. He speaks regularly about the failures of capitalism and the free market. He recently wrote, "My story proves that capitalism doesn't work. It's been 6 years and not one big company followed suit. Companies will never voluntarily do the right thing. I think about how corporations used child labor until it was outlawed." Here he's talking about the fact that we see that here there is like, there seems to be a profit incentive. His company made more money after giving everybody this incredibly high minimum wage. Yeah, I don't know what, I guess I should have looked this up, but I don't know what the minimum wage is in Canada, but here it's like $7 in a lot of places, which is really unrealistic. You can't live, that's not a living wage. Yeah, so in Dan Price's example, it really did work, but these companies are valuing individual profits like for people at the very top rather than all the employees thriving together. So while we don't believe that internal change is the most effective way to ensure ethical communication, the amount of intense pushback that Dr. Gabru and her co-lead, Margaret Mitchell, the intense amount of pushback that they received for trying to, do ethical things, this kind of just demonstrates something heartening to me as well. This must be like on an individual level, this really proves to me what kind of impact that they must have made before they were fired for Google to have such an intense pushback to them. Yes, okay, go ahead, Liana.
So yeah, we want to focus on accountability in these programs, DEI programs and the like, so that we can address how they aren't, or the ways that they could better promote real equity instead of focusing on legal liability. Next slide.
Okay.
So yes, accountability. I recommend to everyone to read Donna Haraway. She's a feminist philosopher and writer. Her methodology of situated knowledges, I think, is very can be used to do lead towards accountability work. She's talking about science, but it's anything to do with like what we value. In situated knowledges, you value vulnerability, responsibility, and trust. So we had a comment about people being scared of that vulnerability and wanting to pull back. And we really need to value that vulnerability and work with it. Yeah, that's what I think ethical communication looks like in this business context. So we're also thinking about how communication is a way to maintain or disrupt social practices. We each have power to enact or to make the world what we want it to look like. Of course, we have more power together.
Yeah, and then there is also a certain urgency as these tech companies, they progress exponentially faster and further. And these mega corporations, they've been able to create technology that affects all of us with our input. The example I'm giving here is facial recognition tech. I didn't even know that the more I'm learning about AI, the more I'm like, oh, it can't be unbiased, right? It only replicates what it's already seeing from the data it's been given, which is human, which means it has human biases. I didn't realize that facial recognition tech was even a thing on the ballot, or there were laws created against it. I didn't know that there were even laws being broached potentially for it. these are technologies that affect all of us without our input, because I don't want to be surveilled. I think lots of people don't. And a lot of these ways, they frequently lack those ethical considerations. So we need to interrogate the ways that these corporations structure and mediate communication channels with both the public as well as their own employees. And we need to find ways to hold them accountable. We shouldn't let structures of communications break down to the point that violence is the only mode left. So, and some of the examples would be like cultural oversight committees with real influence on decision makings, and then other checks and balances that we can create, feedback mechanisms, as well as closing legal loopholes on discrimination. Liana?
Yeah, and as individuals, I do think something that everyone can do is analyze their own relationship to professionalism. Have you seen it, or how can you challenge it? How can you be an ally to changing that workplace culture to be more what you want to see? Are there committees you can join? We definitely ask yourself these questions, and yeah, know that it is a systemic problem and will be solved with systemic solutions as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely believe in worker power, so band together if you can. Okay, and our final quote is from Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit in 2004. The grounds for hope are in the shadows, and the people who are inventing the world while no one looks, who themselves don't know yet whether they will have any effect. So I think a lot of you generally would be students, right? So you don't necessarily know yet what piece of the world you will end up trying to create these fixes for. What we want people to keep doing is to interrogate power structures and fight back against exploitation. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, none of us are free until all of us are free. Work together for each other, because when you fight for yourself, you also fight for other people. When you fight for other people, you also fight for yourself. So in summation, oh, sorry, what?
No, I just also want to say too, I recognize that there is a difference between American and Canadian politics and the way things are viewed. I definitely think, we were talking about hidden workers, right? There is you have to train yourself to see the absences of trust and of, because people are not being able to be heard, right? So it's actually really hard to know who is being affected by what and how, because of these communication breakdowns that are in place on purpose so that people remain hidden.
Yeah, I mean, content moderation, right? It's really advantageous for companies like Facebook if you think that that work is primarily being done by robots, because then you don't feel so surveilled, but you are so surveilled. Most of the work is being done by humans. There's humans who have to read the worst stuff on the internet in order to keep your kids safe, right? This is not done by robots. This is but it's advantageous for Facebook that you think that, oh, it's a lot easier to keep the world a safer place than it actually is. These workers didn't work.
Sorry.
Because there's also a reputational kind of benefit there.
Just to
we are
summarize.
running out of time. Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Are we? I can do.
Yeah.
We're just going to summarize. Yeah. Okay.
Sounds great.
So corporations use communications to increase the perception of equity and other obfuscations of truth, like we've gone over through these different programs. This is what they say, and then the problem is, what makes it unethical is that what they're actually doing is often profit motivated against worker health and worker rights, and can be altered doing a variety of things, including establishing committees with real powers, regulations, and unions, and valuing vulnerability, responsibility, and trust. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Very informative.
Yes, and then if you have any questions for us, you can hit us up on LinkedIn or at our email addresses.
Yes, we did save questions, but unfortunately there's so much information we did run short on time. We do have a few minutes though. If you do want, I can read a couple of the questions off.
Sounds good.
Okay, so How do you address, Cheryl asked, how do you address leadership that responds, the jobs are open to anyone, everyone can apply, so I don't see any barriers?
Yikes. So everyone can apply, but there have been studies done that are very like direct studies. So like you send out the same resume, but you put like either a female name or a name that doesn't sound as, you know, traditionally white. Well, that's a weird way to say it, because it's not like you can't name any person Kevin, right? But a name like Kevin is gonna have a lot more luck than a name like Maliha, which is like both, it's got racial markers because it's an Arabic name, and then it's got like that feminine marker. I mean, if you know that Maliha's a female name, I guess that would take cultural stuff as well. But like, yeah, there's been like studies showing this, so anybody can apply. But the matter of who does get hired, that is definitely a part of it. Like it's definitely up for question.
It comes down to the power dynamic. Like, people like these kind of conversations can lead, you can hear in it kind of the defensiveness, which it like, well, sometimes it's not worth having those conversations. It's just worth having equal power dynamics. Like, we can't have the CEOs have all of the power in making decisions. Like, it's as simple as that. If that happened, if we had true DEI initiatives that addressed hiring practices, for example, we wouldn't need to talk to one person and say, hey, like, I'm gonna go through your logic and try to unpick it, because they have their logic set sometimes too. Like, those conversations can be not as helpful as addressing the power in the situation.
Yeah, and one of the things that we talked about with regards to googliness, like if you can hire people on googliness and googliness is not a defined characteristic, you could say googliness is anything. It's like, and if you're working purely on instinct instead of something that's quantifiable, there is a chance that you're going to get caught up in biases and end up just hiring people who remind you of yourself, because a lot of these people who in hiring positions are like, how to say it, they're like knowledgeable, they're experts in their job, they want to hire people who are good, and to them they're like, what if what looks like good is somebody who is like me? So then the people who are hiring sometimes end up hiring people tend to be like themselves rather than looking for a diverse group, like purposely going out of their way to hire people of other genders, of other races, and so on.
Allie, did we have more questions?
I have one more, probably time for one more. Wilda asked, in your opinion, is corporate culture a subculture?
Yeah, I'd say so. Because it's not necessarily like, some aspects of it obviously are replicated in like the government, for instance. It's like a lot of bureaucracy in government. There's also a lot of people who deal with the organizational issues of not being able to like talk back without retaliation, stuff like that. So, but I'd say that it is a unique subculture still. How about you?
I'm wondering what having it be a subculture really represents. Like, our point is definitely that it shares in the larger culture's biases, and in that way it's not a subculture. The subculture is only in like feeling like you can't talk, whereas on the street you could talk, sort of thing. Yeah, I'd say that.
Okay,
All right.
is there a possibility of having another question?
They're on mute.
Oh, Allie, you're
Yeah,
muted.
I know, sorry. One more quick question. So we have a question. The name got auto-corrected. It says skinny, but I don't believe that's what it was. It says, in your mind, what's an acceptable level of internal agitation or disruption that a corporation should be prepared to accept once they embark on a path to improve DEI?
Well, obviously we don't want it to get to the point of violent communication where it becomes very invested in, what's the word, like, oh wait, how do I, oh no, I don't know how to.
Maybe just go back to Zoom.
I shouldn't have done this. Okay, cool. So obviously we wanted to not get to the point of violent communication. So what corporations would rather do instead would be start by, oh, is it, can you still hear me? Oh,
But
okay.
I do think there is room for a lot more agitation as long as people feel like safe and that they are being respected. Like there is a way to have important conversations.
Yeah, because employees generally, the agitation that it looks like is literally just a group of employees, for instance, talking together to their HR manager, like, hi, we've noticed there's a pay discrepancy between the men and the women here, right? Like just straight up. That's a form of agitation that like, you know, there's laws against punishing it now. Like you can't tell your employees not to talk about their wages anymore. That's against the law. But it used to not be against the law, and you could get punished for talking to people about it. There have been people at Google, like people at Google, they shared a big doc where everybody just put in their, it was like a big Excel spreadsheet kind of thing where they put in their title and their how much they're getting paid. And this was like, oh, it's open. Now I can see exactly how much I'm underpaid or overpaid. That's a form of agitation that was retaliated against the creator of the document, but it shouldn't be, right? Like that's the kind of thing that they're, yeah. Like it's considered agitation because it's like this kind of employee agitation is like when they point out that you're doing something wrong, the first thing that they will do is usually like do it in a peaceful way, like try to keep it internal. They're not, generally employees aren't going to go directly to like, let's tell the media, let's make it so that the company is hurting immediately. No, they will generally go to companies first, I think, to try to talk to them about it.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we have any more time for questions. I did have a question just from Amber. I did send your appendix, but she just wondered to make sure that the comments that you did make about Google were quantifiable, just to add reliability to your statements. But that may have been in the appendix you sent me. I did share that in the chat.
Cool. Thank you very much for all your help, Ali. You're doing really great in moderating this. But yeah, so as for if it's quantifiable, the problem is that certain, like racism is not always quantifiable, right? Like we can't quantify googliness. We can't call it quantify what it means. When we're talking about some of these things, a lot of what we're using is also like qualitative methods. Like the reason we know that googliness is like a code, it's like, you know, it's a coded term that can mean like, oh, if you're not like me, then you're this or that, then you're unprofessional, or then you're like unhireable by Google. The reason that we're saying this is not because there's like studies done on it. It's because there's lots of Google employees who come from marginalized backgrounds who see themselves being treated in certain ways and called ungoogly, that other people who are like maybe white or maybe men, like they are not treated in the same way. So like, for instance, the thing we said about anger, like to me just acted like, you know, people call Dr. Gabru, by people, I mean like she might be called ungoogly when in fact she is like, she's an innovator, she's very smart, she's like a world expert in her like topic. There's, you know, how much googlier can you get? And yet like because she's like so angry, she's tired and retaliated against.
So I mean, we grew up there. We know, and we worked in that area. We've met people who talk to Google too. That's part of our evidence. I guess that's what you're saying. It's qualitative. Like we've talked
like
to
what is our
about
evidence is what they're asking, and it's like, yeah, some of it is again quantifiable. There are studies done on the name thing that we're talking about. Like, you know, there's no studies done on the googliness thing because how do you measure it? I mean, I certainly don't know. The only way I'd measure it is like literally just what I've been doing, talking to people and saying, hey, have you heard about this googliness thing? What do you think about it? Yeah.
That's great context. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that context there. So I think that should about wrap it up, unless you two have any final statements to make. Really quick,
just thank you for having us.
Chase, come on the video. He's gonna kick us out.
Yeah. And yeah, please continue working hard and making your workplaces better. And I heard somebody talking about sweeping statements, and it's like, I know they seem sweeping, but we're talking about like, there's nothing we're saying that we haven't seen people say, or we haven't seen like large groups of people say. Most of it is not coming from just one person, except for, you know, like maybe this one person told us this one specific story or something, but like a lot of these are extrapolatory, like you can extrapolate them. That's not the
and we'd love to hear from you. That's why we have our info on there.
Yes, yes, please feel free.
Thanks so much, Chase.
Thank you for coming, and it's great to hear. You know, great to hear what's happening but south of the border for us here in Canada. And it's great to see that you're both safe and well and sheltering the pandemic. So I hope that continues in a positive direction for you in the States as well as us up here. And so thanks again for talking and taking the time and sharing your thoughts on such an important topic.
Thank you.
And if people reach out to us, we'll make sure to pass along your contact information if they have questions afterwards or what have you. I'm assuming that's okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We can also make sure to put our email addresses in because I know I took the screen down. We'll put them in the appendix, and then you can reach out to us if you remember to open it up. So it's tinyurl.com/lipservice appendix. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
Bye now.
Bye.
So for folks sticking around for the next talk, we'll start in about 5 minutes. And that will be with Dr. Wayne Clark. And Dr. Wayne Clark will be speaking about cultural safety and anti-racism in health and social systems. Dr. Clark is a former grad of the MAPC, so it's great to have him back for this talk. So please go refresh yourselves and come back for that talk in about five minutes. We might start a little bit after 2.
And I see that Dr. Clark is here, and so I've made you co-host. So when it's time, you're ready to go.
Great, thanks.